As we've been looking at the revivalist developments in America in the early to mid 19th century, we've already seen some things that are somewhat eccentric. That's a great word, eccentric. Outside the center, beyond the center, moving, kind of spinning almost out of control. And when we look at religion in 19th century America, we find a number of eccentricities developing, some what we might think of kind of mainline eccentricities, and some really spinning far away from the center, becoming what we generally call cults. Cults or sects are groups that have developed so much of their own theology and their own character away from the received truth of Christianity, usually away from not just evangelical Christianity, but away from Catholic Christianity, that is, rejecting the doctrine of God or the doctrine of Christ that had been received in the church from the ancient church period. And so I want us to pause a little bit to look at eccentricities, first of all in terms of cults in America, because America has probably been the most productive source of cults of any place on earth and any time in the history of the church. I don't think that's something we should be overly proud of, but it's a reality that we ought to pause and reflect on. Why has America been so productive of cults? And I think part of the reason is simply that America has been so free in terms of religion. Since there has not been legal restriction on the practice of religion, unless a cult gets involved in something really wild like the use of peyote or some mind-altering drug or something illegal in that sense, the forces of the law have not come down on that religion. Mormonism, early Mormonism would be another example, because early Mormonism believed in polygamy. They were really not initially allowed to exist in the United States, but were forced out of the United States. And not until the prophet received a revelation putting an end to polygamy was Utah able to come into the Union because of the strong presence of Mormonism there. So the freedom of religion in America does have limits, but the limits are pretty broad. And that broad limit of religion has allowed the development of any number of cults. And we can't talk about them all, but I thought it might be worth taking a little bit of time to talk about what are these cults like? What are the characteristics of cults that would help us analyze them and think about them? And I think we could say that cults tend to have four particular characteristics. Now, not every cult has all four. Some will only have one. Some will overlap to two or three. But I think these four characteristics are helpful in thinking about the driving force of cults. The first kind of cult we have are what we could call restorationist cults. These are cults that tend to teach that true Christianity has been lost sometime in the past and now is finally being properly restored. Mormons are a good example of that. Joseph Smith taught that the revelation given to him was a revelation showing how true Christianity had died out early in the history of the church, and only now with the restoration of the prophetic office was true Christianity and the true practice of Christianity being restored. So restorationist cults are usually wanting to go back to the very beginning of the church with a claim that they alone are the representation of the true church. So that's one kind of cult. Another kind of cult that has been very popular are healing cults. Mark Twain once remarked that no one has ever gone broke duping the American public with claims of healing. And especially in the 19th century, when, as I said, medicine, real medicine, doctors were very limited in what they knew and what they could do, people were very open to the snake oil sellers, as they used to say. People with special potions, but also then people with special powers, special approaches to healing. And in the 19th century, probably the most famous healing cult was Christian Science. founded by Mary Baker Eddy, and her famous book, Science and Health with Keys to the Scripture. But Christian Science was not only a healing cult, but it also represented the third kind of cults that we could talk about, and that is cults that focused on spirituality. A different kind of spirituality, a different kind of way of practicing religion, a different way of understanding the presence and the power of God amongst His people. And Mary Baker Eddy, in a rather remarkable way, combined a new approach to spirituality in a way that would lead, she insisted, to healing. And Mormonism and Christian Science are interesting kind of polar opposites when it comes to cults, because Mormonism is a cult almost entirely focused on the physical, the importance of marriage sealed for eternity, the importance of the temple and fulfilling your obligations in the temple, the notion that you will become a god of your own world, if you're a man, and reign over that world populated by your own children in a time to come. And it's so focused on the physical that Mormonism teaches that the Holy Spirit actually has a body that He gave up to do His spiritual work, but to which He will return. And therefore, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are three gods because they each have their own body. And at least some teaching within Mormonism says we can all become gods. As we are, so once God was. As God is, so we can be. That was a teaching of Mormonism. And so you have this radically kind of physical religion in which marriage becomes the most essential thing. And then on the opposite extreme, you have Christian Science, which is almost a wholly spiritual approach to reality. What Mary Baker Eddy really said is, there is no physical reality. Physical reality is entirely an illusion. It's a result of evil forces controlling your mind. And what you need to do is to liberate your mind from the illusion of the physical. And once you are freed from the illusion of the body, you will also be freed from the illusion of sickness. Where there is no body, there can be no physical illness. And so the way to treat illness is to treat the mind to triumph over the illusion of physicality. And therefore, in Christian Science, there is, in the nature of the case, no possibility of physical death, because the body is an illusion, and therefore it cannot die. You're all looking terribly skeptical. But this was the teaching of Mary Baker Eddy, and I always remember my father, who was a sort of skeptical guy, had a very good friend who was a Christian Scientist, and his first wife died of cancer, and my father went to offer condolences, and his friend said, no, Enid is still with me. So when a couple of years later he was going to remarry, my father went to him and said, what are you going to do with Enid? A lot of skepticism amongst the Godfreys. But see, this was the ideal, that if you can simply train your mind to overcome the illusion of sickness, of pain, of the body, of death, these things will not be true. They will disappear, and you will be triumphant over them. So you can see how it's a sort of combination of healing and of spirituality. And I had a friend who worked at one time for the Christian Science Monitor, and she said it was such a challenge. You know, that's a new Christian Science newspaper that comes out of Boston. At one time, I don't hear so much about it anymore, but at one time it was a very distinguished newspaper. But she said it was always difficult to write articles because you could never violate the tenets of Christian Science in writing articles. And so she wanted to write an article on drug abuse. Well, how do you write an article on drug abuse when there are no drugs and there are no bodies? You know, it becomes complicated. They used to Photoshop photographs for the Christian Science Monitor to take out eyeglasses, because eyeglasses, of course, are not necessary if you just think properly. I always speculated with her, I wonder what kind of headlines they would do, like when President Roosevelt died. I imagine the headline was, Truman becomes president. I mean, it's always a question, how do you even communicate in this kind of a world? But it had an attraction, you see. There are some people, I think, normally naturally attracted to the notion that the physical is the most real, and other people attracted to the notion it's the spiritual that is the most real. And in a country where there's freedom, people can exercise this kind of religion. Why do you think they exercise their religion in that way? I think often one factor is really powerful charismatic leaders. It has to be that Joseph Smith as the first prophet and then Brigham Young as the next prophet were powerful, charismatic with a small c, not Pentecostal, but just very effective communicators, dominant personalities, driven by their own vision in such a powerful way that other people are drawn in. Mary Baker Eddy must have had that same kind of leadership quality about her. And of course, people are gullible. P.T. Barnum, there's a sucker born every minute. I mean, people want to believe certain things. And it's much easier, somebody said, to get people to believe what they want to believe than to get them to believe what they don't want to believe. And of course, ultimately, we believe this was a demonic strategy to lead people away from the truth. I was quoting Luther at the National Conference this year, and Luther very wisely said, wherever God builds his church, the devil builds a chapel next door, and the chapel is always bigger. It always has something more exciting. And that's sort of the spiritual warfare we find ourselves in. And so the gullibility of people is a real factor in the rise of cults, but also the fact that too many American Protestants were content not to have education or a real theological system. And if you don't have education and a real theological system, you are much more susceptible to someone opening the Bible and saying, now look at that verse. Your denomination doesn't take account of that verse. I can explain that to you. And if you really don't know what you ought to believe, if you don't have a systematic approach to the Bible, it's much easier to be led astray. And I think that has happened over and over again in the history of the American churches. The fourth kind of cult that we have in the history of the American churches is what we could call an eschatology cult. A cult that is so focused on the second coming of Christ that everything is controlled by that expectation. In a sense, we could say that the Seventh-day Adventist movement in its early years had a tendency to be cultic in that regard. The Seventh-day Adventist movement and the Jehovah's Witnesses as a more radical form of some of those impulses really arose out of the teachings of William Miller. Has anybody heard of William Miller? William Miller was a farmer in the early part of the 19th century in America, and he was a careful student of the Bible, and he concluded that he knew the date of Christ's return. Now today that seems like a kind of strange and eccentric point of view. Actually, in the 17th and 18th century, there are a number of people who thought they could calculate the date of Christ's return. But Miller was particularly adamant in teaching this to his followers and attracting a relatively large following. This was one of the fellows from New York who was leading people to be convinced that Christ was returning soon. He set the first date in 1843, and then when Christ didn't return, he recalculated and was absolutely sure Christ would return in October of 1844. And some of his followers actually sold their possessions and prepared for Christ's return. And when Christ did not return in October of 1844, in case you're uncertain, he did not return in October of 1844. This was known as the Great Disappointment. And many people were very disillusioned. Some people abandoned Christianity altogether because of this disappointment. But others, the most prominent of whom was Ellen G. White, said, Miller wasn't really wrong. He simply was wrong in the event that would take place in October of 1844. It was not that Christ would return visibly in glory in October of 1844, but that Christ would rise from his throne to enter the heavenly temple to begin the investigative judgment to determine who would finally enter the eternal kingdom. So the date was right, it was the event that was wrong, and followers of Ellen G. White became the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist movement that still are driven by a kind of eschatological expectation of when Christ will return and what that will all mean. Most Seventh-day Adventists are less cultic today than they once were, but they are still very adamant that Saturday is the Sabbath that Christians ought to keep holy, because Ellen G. White had a vision once of the Ten Commandments with a halo around the fourth commandment. So there's a particular significance to the fourth commandment and to the Saturday Sabbath. One of my own personal favorite cults, which is illustrative of the varieties of things you can find in America, are the Shakers. And now today, a lot of people still are familiar, at least with the word Shaker, and perhaps are familiar with Shaker furniture or Shaker architecture, which is absolutely magnificent. There's a preserved Shaker community in Kentucky at Mount Pleasant, and if you haven't visited there, some of the most beautiful buildings you would ever hope to see. But the theology of the Shakers was really peculiar. The Shakers were inspired by Mother Ann Lee Stanley, an 18th century figure who had gotten her start amongst the Quakers, but became more ecstatic, so she and her followers became known as the Shaking Quakers. I guess they shook more than just quaked. And so they were a group who ardently expected the imminent return of Christ, but Mother Ann Lee taught that Christ would return in his second coming as a woman, and that the proper preparation for Christ's return was to form celibate communities to be governed by millennial laws. So men and women would come into these communities. If they were married, they'd leave their husband or wife either outside the community or bring husband and wife into the community to lead a celibate life. Men would live in one building, women in another. And this was all preparatory to the coming of Christ, which they believed was fairly imminent. This movement particularly flourished between 1830 and 1850. Some 6,000 people formed some 19 communities across the Midwest and eastern part of the United States, forming these millennial communities where they lived very simply, developed simple architecture, simple styles of furniture to sell, to make money, to support the community. They were most famous, of course, for their celibate life, no marriage, and also famous for their ecstatic worship services, where they would speak in tongues and dance. And out of those worship services came some interesting hymns. The most famous is "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple," with a beautiful tune that inspired, I think it was Aaron Copland, to write a symphony with that tune as a recurring theme. And it expresses something of what their spirituality was about. "'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight." But it goes on then, "When true simplicity is gained, to bow and bend, we shan't be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right." So dancing was an essential part of their services. Apparently early on ecstatic dancing, later it became more formalized, but the idea of dance was that dancing in worship was a kind of form of spiritual humility, and that most people were too proud to dance. Another of the hymns that I particularly like, although I'm a psalm singer, goes this way: "Come life, shaker life, come life eternal, shake, shake out of me all that is carnal. I'll take nimble steps, I'll be a David, I'll show Michael twice how he behaved." You get the illusion. David danced before the ark because he was so humble, but his wife Michael criticized him because she was proud and arrogant. But the Lord condemned her. And so we need to be humble. We need to humble ourselves. Ascetic communities always have trouble surviving. They don't replicate well. And so the Shakers have struggled that way. But this is an important part of the American scene, where you have many voices claiming to be biblical in the interest of restoring the true church, of bringing healing into the church, of bringing true spirituality into the church, bringing proper anticipation of the coming of Christ into the church. And many souls have been seriously led astray. It's also true, I think people sometimes have a desire to be the only ones who really know the truth. It's just us who are really right. Now that's true only of Calvinists, right? But Calvinism has never had that extreme exclusivity. Other people may not be as right as we are, but other people are going to heaven. But these cults almost always said, we're the only people going to heaven. We're the only people who really follow the law. We're the only people who really understand. And so I don't think we understand the character of American religious experience except to see that the freedom we enjoy also has the dangers of allowing people to just go crazy. If I knew anything about physics, I could make some analogy to free radicals, maybe spinning off. But since I don't, I won't. And we'll conclude our lecture here with going on next time to look at the Presbyterian witness in 19th century America and how important it was to the defense of true religion. Thank you very much.